On a sweltering afternoon in the heart of a bustling downtown street, the air was thick with the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of pedestrians, weaving through their day. Amid this ordinary scene, a sleek black Mercedes gleamed under the sun, parked neatly along the curb. Its polished surface caught the eye of John Miller, a veteran police officer whose 2 decades on the force had hardened him into a man of unyielding resolve. To John, the world was a place steadily softening, crumbling under the weight of leniency, and he saw himself as a bulwark against that tedious disciplined enforcer of order, who never let emotions cloud his judgment. Authority to him was not just a tool but a sacred duty, and any hint of defiance was a crack in the foundation he'd spent years fortifying. As he gazed at the Mercedes, something stirred within him an inexplicable itch, a flicker of suspicion that didn't need a reason. He flipped on his patrol car's lights, their sharp red and blue pulses cutting through the daylight, and signaled the driver to stop. Inside the car sat Rachel Taylor, a black woman whose modest attire belied the quiet strength she carried. She watched the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, her hands steady on the wheel, her breath measured. Rachel was no stranger to moments like this encounters with police that demanded an extra layer of caution where the rules seemed to shift without warning. She pulled over smoothly, her movements deliberate, her mind racing to piece together what might have prompted the stop. There'd been no speeding, no broken taillight, nothing she could pinpoint. Yet here she was, staring into the unknown, her calm exterior masking a ripple of unease. John stepped out of his patrol car, his boots striking the pavement with a heavy, deliberate thud that echoed his sense of purpose. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, and as he approached Rachel's window, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that bordered on accusation. Without a word of explanation, he barked, "Step out of the car immediately." His voice was a steel blade, cutting through the ambient noise of the street. Rachel's brow furrowed slightly, but she held her composure, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "Sir," she said, her tone steady yet laced with a quiet courage, "what have I done wrong? I believe I have the right to know why I'm being stopped." Her words hung in the air, simple but piercing, a plea for clarity in a moment that felt anything but clear. To John, her question was a spark igniting a fire he didn't expect. In his 20 years wearing the badge, he'd grown accustomed to obedience, swift, unquestioning compliance that affirmed his control. Rachel's calm inquiry felt like a challenge, a subtle defiance that gnawed at the edges of his authority. His jaw tightened, his pride bristling. "I don't owe you any explanation," he snapped, his voice rising with a forceful edge. "Step out of the car right now." Rachel exhaled slowly, her hands still gripping the wheel, her mind weighing the cost of resistance against the sting of injustice. "I understand," she replied, her tone unwavering, "but I think asking for a reason is reasonable. I haven't done anything wrong. You've followed all the traffic rules." By now, the scene had begun to draw eyes. A handful of pedestrians paused along the sidewalk, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding tension. A middle-aged woman named Clara, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, muttered to her friend beside her, "There's no reason to stop her. This is ridiculous." Her voice carried a mix of disbelief and indignation, her head shaking as she watched John's stern figure loom over the car. Nearby, a young man named Malik slowed his pace, his brow furrowing as he took in the exchange. The skepticism in the air was palpable, a quiet murmur of doubt that only fueled John's growing irritation. He leaned closer to Rachel's window, his breath hot with menace. "You don't have the right to ask," he growled. "Get out of the car immediately, or I'll have to use stronger measures." Rachel's eyes held his, unyielding, though beneath her steady gaze lay a storm of emotions: frustration, resignation, and a deep-seated resolve not to let fear take root. "I'm not trying to resist," she said slowly, each word deliberate, "but I need to know the reason. Otherwise, this feels unfair." Her voice was soft but firm, a quiet stand against the weight of his aggression. To John, those words were a dagger, slicing through the armor of his self-assured dominance. He wasn't used to this, though, someone meeting his force with reason, especially not someone he'd already judged as beneath his command. His authority, the bedrock of his identity, felt suddenly unsteady, and that sensation enraged him. Without another word, he yanked the car door open, his movements rough and impulsive. His hand clamped around Rachel's arm, pulling her out with a force that sent a jolt through her frame. She stumbled slightly, but steadied herself, her dignity intact despite the harshness of his grip. "What are you doing?" Malik shouted from the crowd, his voice cracking with outrage as he stepped closer, fists clenched at his sides. "She hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you pulling her out like that?" Beside him, Clara pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling with anger as she began recording. "This is an abuse of power," she said, her voice rising over the growing murmur of the onlookers. She only asked for a reason. Rachel, now standing on the pavement, kept her eyes locked on John. There was no fear in her expression, only a profound disappointment that seemed to bore into him. "Are you sure this is how a police officer should act?" she asked softly, her words barely audible over the crowd's rising clamor, yet they struck John like a thunderclap. His pride recoiled, wounded by the quiet power of her question. He fumbled for the handcuffs at his belt, his movements brusque as he snapped them onto her wrists. "Save it for the judge," he muttered, trying to reclaim his footing, though his voice betrayed a tremor of doubt he couldn't fully suppress. The crowd erupted, their voices weaving into a chorus of dissent. "Let her go," Malik yelled, his anger boiling over as he gestured toward Rachel. Clara shook her head, her eyes blazing as she kept her camera steady. "There's no reason to treat her like this," she said, her words a sharp rebuke. Every shout, every accusing stare pressed in on John, a suffocating tide he couldn't escape. Yet his pride stubborn, unyielding, refused to let him back down. He dragged Rachel toward his patrol car, her steps measured and calm despite his roughness, the crowd's disapproval a deafening roar in his ears. To John, this was still just an exercise in control, a necessary show of strength to uphold the law as he saw it. But to those watching, it was something else entirely, a stark betrayal of the justice he'd sworn to protect. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the video Clara had captured spread like wildfire across social media. Grainy footage of John wrenching Rachel from her car looped endlessly, each share amplifying the public's outrage. Comments poured in, a torrent of condemnation, abuse of power, police brutality, discrimination, words that branded John as the villain in a story he'd never intended to star in. At the police station, Captain David Martinez sat in his dimly lit office, the glow of his computer screen casting harsh shadows across his face. He replayed the video, his jaw tight, his eyes cold with a mix of fury and disbelief. He'd known John for years, respected his experience, but this was a wound to the department's soul, a public unraveling of trust he couldn't ignore. When John stepped into Martinez's office, the air was thick with tension, a storm brewing behind the captain's desk. Martinez didn't rise, didn't offer a seat, just fixed John with a stare that could have shattered stone. "Do you realize what you've done, Miller?" he asked, his voice low but searing with disappointment. John squared his shoulders, clinging to his defiance. "Sir, I was just doing my job. That woman refused to cooperate when I asked her to step out, and I had to enforce my authority." Martinez's lips curled into a bitter smile, his eyes flashing. "Enforce your authority? What happened to your responsibility to the public? This video's everywhere, Miller. People see you, and they think that's you. That's the whole damn department." John's voice strained as he pushed back. "She wasn't cooperating, sir. She challenged me, and I couldn't let that stand. A police officer has to maintain respect. Without it, we lose control." Martinez leaned back, arms crossed, his gaze dissecting John's every word. "Respect," he said, the word dripping with scorn. "You think respect comes from force, from dragging a woman out of her car for no reason? True respect comes from serving the community, not bullying it into submission. You've torn down everything we're trying to build." John bristled, his pride flaring. "She wasn't following orders, sir. I can't let anyone defy me like that." Martinez's voice hardened, cutting through John's excuses. "And for that, you think you've got the right to manhandle her in front of a crowd? No reason, no explanation, just your ego? That video's proof of abuse, Miller, and it's everywhere." John fell silent, frustration coiling in his chest, though Martinez's words began to chip away at his certainty. "I only did what I thought was right," he muttered, stubborn to the end. Martinez slammed his hand on the desk, the sound of gunshot in the quiet room. Right? This is your right. We're here to protect, to make people feel safe, not to terrorize them. You were wrong, Miller, dead wrong. You're suspended, effective immediately. There'll be an investigation, and you'll face the consequences. John froze, shock and anger crashing over him like a wave. Suspended, for this? I've given 20 years to this force. His words trailed off, swallowed by the weight of Martinez's stare. As he left the office, the echoes of the day replayed in his mind: the crowd's cries, Rachel's piercing question, the video's relentless spread. What he'd seen as justice, others saw as tyranny, and the consequences of his unchecked power were only beginning to unfold. For Rachel, for the onlookers, for the thousands online, this wasn't just a moment, it was a lesson carved in the raw truth of accountability. A reminder that authority without justice is a hollow shell destined to crack. The air in the room hung thick with tension as Captain Martinez's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and unyielding, like a winter wind cutting through an empty street. 20 years or 200, John, it doesn't make a lick of difference, he said, his tone frigid. His eyes locked onto the man standing before him. If you can't grasp the heart of what this job demands, real purpose, behind the badge, you've already lost the faith of the people we're here to protect. And when that trust crumbles, it doesn't just weaken you, it drags the whole force down with it. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. As for those 20 years you keep clinging to, maybe it's time you ask yourself if they were spent serving justice, or just propping up your own excuses. John Miller stood rooted to the spot, his broad shoulders stiff, his jaw clenched tight. Inside, a storm churning danger flared hot in his chest, tangling with a creeping confusion that gnawed at the edges of his mind. For years, he'd walked these halls as a man respected, even admired, by his fellow officers. Their nods of approval, the camaraderie forged in late-night patrols and high-stakes pursuits, had been the bedrock of his pride. But now, under Martinez's piercing gaze, that pride felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He couldn't muster a single word in his defense. His tongue felt heavy, useless. The captain leaned back in his creaky leather chair, his stern expression softening just a fraction, though the gravity in his dark eyes never wavered. Miller, this isn't about Yunet really. It's about the people out there, the ones we swore to look after. We can't have an officer who tramples on their trust, who thinks this badge is a free pass to throw their weight around. I won't let anyone at even Yao tear down what we've fought tooth and nail to build. Those words landed like a sledgehammer to John's ego. His breath hitched, but he kept his face a mask of stone. Without a sound, he turned on his heel and strode out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his ears. As he moved down the dimly lit hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, his mind spun in a chaotic whirl. Pride battled fury, and beneath it all lurked a flicker of doubt, something unfamiliar, something he hadn't felt in years. Had he really been so wrong about what it meant to wear this uniform? The thought gnawed at him, sharp and persistent, as he passed familiar faces. But today, those faces were different. Where there had once been warm greetings or knowing grins, now there was only a chilling distance. Officers he'd shared coffee with at 3 a.m., men and women who'd had his back in the thick of danger, averted their eyes or stepped aside as he approached. Whispers trailed in his wake, soft but cutting, like the rustle of leaves in a storm. To them, he was no longer one of their own, was an outsider, a pariah marked by his own actions. The sting of their rejection pierced deeper than any reprimand from Martinez. John's chest tightened as he wondered what they saw when they looked at him now. Did they understand that every choice he'd made, every hard line he'd drawn, had come from a place of duty? He'd wanted to keep order, to enforce fairness in a world that too often spiraled into chaos. Or had they only ever seen a man too drunk on his own authority, too blind to the damage he'd caused? The questions clawed at him, relentless, trapping him in a suffocating web of guilt and uncertainty. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down, a cold blade slicing through the armor of his self-assurance. The next day, John sat in a cramped meeting room, the air stale and heavy with unspoken tension. Martinez stood at the front, his voice ringing out with the same unyielding clarity as before. But this time, his words weren't just a personal rebuke, they were a public dissection of John's failures. "This isn't just about one man's mistakes," Martinez declared, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on John. "It's about what those mistakes cost us all. One officer's recklessness doesn't just hurt a single person, it chips away at the trust this department has spent decades earning." His words were precise, each one a dagger aimed straight at John's carefully constructed facade. The captain didn't relent, painting a vivid picture of an innocent citizen wronged, a community betrayed, all because John had let his pride override his duty. John sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, but inside, he was reeling. Around him, the room seemed to close in. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues boring into him, some filled with quiet disappointment, others with outright disdain. A young officer across the table shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor as if he couldn't bear to look at John any longer. Another, a grizzled veteran who'd once clapped John on the back after a tough shift, stared straight ahead, his lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. The silence from those who'd once been his allies spoke louder than any words. John had always prided himself on his unshakable resolve, on enforcing the law with an iron fist to keep the streets safe. But now, isolated in that sea of judgment, he couldn't escape the question: had his version of justice been just a mask for something uglier? The meeting dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. John's mind drifted to memories of his early days on the force nights spent chasing down suspects, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as he barked orders and demanded compliance. Back then, he'd seen fear in people's eyes as a sign of respect, a necessary tool to maintain control. Now, those same images twisted in his mind, warped and hollow. What if that fear hadn't been respect at all? What if it had been resentment, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to boil over? For the first time, John glimpsed the possibility that his rigid principlicious refusal to bend, to show mercy, might have been less about strength and more about shielding himself from his own doubts. The realization settled over him like a suffocating fog, heavy and inescapable. When he finally returned home that evening, the silence of his small apartment felt oppressive. The worn couch, the chipped coffee mug on the counter, the faded photos of better days of it seemed alien, as if he no longer belonged here either. He sank into a chair, staring blankly at the wall, the echoes of Martinez's words reverberating in his skull. Could he change? Could he unlearn the habits of 2 decades and rebuild what he'd shattered? The questions gnawed at him, offering no answers, only a restless unease that kept him awake into the early hours. In his fitful sleep, fragmented dreams played out like a grainy film reel, moments where he'd stood tall and unyielding, his voice booming with authority, now tinged with a haunting regret. By morning, a fragile resolve had taken root. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could start listening, understanding, instead of commanding and condemning. The road ahead loomed long and uncertain, but for the first time, John felt a spark of determination to walk it. Weeks later, after a suspension that left him restless and brooding, a curt message from Martinez arrived. To keep his job, John had to complete a 3-month empathy training course. The news hit him like a punch to the gut, bruising his already battered pride. But the real blow came when he learned the instructor's Namrical Taylor, the woman whose life he'd upended in the incident that had sparked this whole mess. The thought of facing her week after week filled him with a bitter mix of shame and dread, a sour taste that lingered in his throat. On the first day of the course, he strode into the meeting room with his usual swagger, his face set in a hard, defiant mask. He claimed a seat in the back, arms crossed tightly over his chest, signaling to everyone that he was here under duress, not by choice. To him, this was a farce, a public relations stunt dressed up as redemption, nothing more. Rachel entered moments later, her presence a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside John. She moved with a quiet confidence, her arms cradling a thick binder stuffed with notes and handouts. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and her eyes scanned the room with a calm assurance that unsettled him. When her gaze briefly met his, John braced himself for a flash of anger or bitterness, something to match the resentment he carried. But there was none. She looked at him with a steady, almost detached neutrality then offered a small, genuine smile to the group. "Hello, everyone," she began, her voice soft but firm, carrying a warmth that filled the sterile room. "I'm Rachel Taylor. This course isn't here to point fingers or tear anyone down. It's a chance for us to step into someone else's shoes, to feel what they feel, and to build something real empathy." John couldn't hold back a scoff, the sound escaping loud enough to turn a few heads. "Empathy," he muttered under his breath, his tone dripping with disdain. "Just some touchy-feely nonsense. Cops don't need that to do their jobs." Rachel's eyes flicked toward him, catching his words. But she didn't flinch. She pressed on undeterred. "Let's start by going around the room. Share a time when you felt misunderstood or judged unfairly, something personal." One by one, the others spoke stories of being dismissed because of their race, their gender, or the way they looked. Their voices carried a raw honesty that John found irritatingly earnest. When it was his turn, he leaned back further in his chair, his arms still crossed, and fixed Rachel with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You want me to share?" he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Fine. I don't have some sob story for you. I'm only here because I was ordered to be, not because I think I need this or any of this weakness you're peddling." Rachel held his gaze, unflinching, her expression steady as a rock in a storm. "I get that you don't see the value in this yet, John," she said, her tone gentle but edged with resolve. "But empathy isn't weakness, it's strength, kind that lets you connect, that lets you see the story behind the person. Everyone's got their pain, their struggles. Understanding that doesn't make you soft, it makes you human." John rolled his eyes, a flash of defiance sparking in his chest. "Strength? I've been a cop for over 20 years, lady. I know what real strength is: keeping order, holding the line. You start coddling everyone, trying to feel their pain, and you lose control. You lose respect." For a moment, Rachel studied him, a faint sadness flickering in her ice-knit pity. But something deeper, something that made John's stomach twist uncomfortably. She took a step closer, her voice still calm, but carrying a quiet intensity. "I'm not asking you to go soft or abandon your duty, John. But a strong person doesn't need to hide behind a wall of rules or a badge. They can listen, they can care, and still stand tall. That's the kind of strength I believe in, the kind this community deserves." Her words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in patience, and for the first time, John felt a crack in his armor, a small, unwelcome tremor of doubt that refused to be ignored. John Miller trudged into the dimly lit training room, his boots scuffing against the worn linoleum floor, his jaw set tight with irritation. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning solution, a sterile backdrop to the tension brewing inside him. He'd been a cop for over 2 decades, and now here he was, forced into some empathy workshop like a rookie who didn't know the streets. His broad shoulders stiffened as he dropped into a chair at the back, arms crossed, his icy blue eyes scanning the room with a mix of defiance and disdain. He didn't need this. He'd faced down armed suspects, broken up fights in dark alleys, and made split-second calls that kept him alive. What could a civilian like Rachel Taylor, with her soft voice and earnest gaze, possibly teach him about his job? Rachel stood at the front, her presence calm yet unyielding, like a lighthouse weathering a storm. She adjusted her glasses, her dark hair pulled back neatly, and met John's glare without flinching. Her brown eyes carried a quiet strength, tinged with a sadness that seemed to linger just beneath the surface. "John," she began, her tone steady but edged with a sharpness that cut through the room's heavy silence. "I'm not here to tell you how to be a cop, but let me ask you this. Imagine someone judging you every day, assuming the worst about you before you even open your mouth, no chance to explain, no room to show who you really are. How would that sit with you?" John's lips twitched, a flicker of unease rippling through him before he smothered it with a scoff. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and his voice came out rough, almost biting. "You don't get it, Rachel. Out there, we don't have time to sit around feeling sorry for people. We act, we have to be tough. Your little thought experiments might sound nice in here, but they don't keep us alive when bullets start flying." His words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive, but beneath them, a tiny thread of hesitation tugged at his chest, gone as quickly as it came. Rachel didn't waver. She stepped closer, her gaze piercing through the armor of his bravado. "I'm not saying your job is easy, John, but have you ever stopped to think about what it's like on the other side? To be seen as a threat just because of how you look, where you're from. To feel that weight every single day." Her voice softened, but her eyes held a fire that made John shift uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't answer, his silence a wall he refused to let crumble. Instead, he stared back, his expression hardening. "I don't need a lecture," he muttered, almost to himself. "I'm a cop. My job is to enforce, not to play therapist." The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with the unspoken clash of their wills. Rachel's face remained composed, but her eyes sharpened, as if she could see the cracks he was desperate to hide. "John, strength isn't just about forcing your way through. Real strength comes when you're brave enough to face yourself, to see the ripple of your actions on others. It's not weakness to listen or change. It's courage." Her words landed like stones in still water, sending waves through John's mind that he couldn't ignore, though he tried. His chest tightened, a restless ache stirring deep within, but he shoved it down, locking his jaw to him. This was all just fluffy nonsense, a distraction from the gritty reality of his world. When the session ended, John stormed out, his heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the peeling paint of the walls. His mind churned, replaying Rachel's words despite his efforts to drown them out. Meaningless. He growled under his breath, clenching his fists. "This won't help me out there yet." As he pushed through the station's double doors into the crisp evening air, a faint whisper of doubt took root, a nagging feeling he couldn't shake, like a splinter lodged deep to ignore. Days passed, and John kept attending the training, though his defiance never softened. He sat apart from the others, his posture rigid, his face a mask of cold detachment. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, officers and civilians mingling awkwardly. But John stayed on the edges, a lone figure wrapped in his own storm. Inside, though, the stories he heard began to seep into him, slow and relentless. Like water wearing down stone, each voice, each memory shared, chipped at the fortress he'd built around his beliefs. One afternoon, Rachel took the floor again, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. She stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, and fixed her gaze on John, as if speaking only to him. "I don't know if any of you have ever been judged purely for how you look," she said, her tone even but heavy with memory. "But that's been my life since I was a kid." John slouched in his chair, arms folded, determined to tune her out. But her words pulled him in, threading through his resistance like a needle through fabric. She spoke of a day when she was 16, walking home from school in her quiet neighborhood. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and her backpack bounced lightly against her shoulders. She could still feel the crunch of gravel under her sneakers, the faint hum of cicadas in the trees. Then came the flashing lights, the screech of tires as a patrol car pulled up beside her. "I wasn't doing anything," she said, her voice trembling for a moment before steadying. "Just walking home." But to them, a black girl in that area was trouble. "They made me stand by the curb, searched my bag, wouldn't let me say a word." Her eyes glistened, but she held her head high, recounting the humiliation with a dignity that struck John like a punch. He shifted in his seat, a pang twisting in his gut. He'd heard stories like this, dismissed them as exaggerations, collateral damage of the job. But now, with Rachel's voice painting the scene, he could almost see it, her small frame tense against the curb, the officers looming over her, their hands rifling through her things. She continued, her tone softening but carrying a bitter edge. "I could have let it make me angry. Bitter, but my dad had taught me something. He said real strength isn't in fighting back with fists or shouting. It's an understanding, in turning pain into something better. That's why I'm here, trying to make sure others don't feel what I did." John's eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, he didn't look away. She didn't seem weak or broken, just resolute, standing there with a quiet power that unnerved him. His mind flickered to his own definition of strength, the iron grip of control, the unyielding force he'd always relied on. Was it possible he'd been wrong? The thought gnawed at him, sharp and unwelcome, but he couldn't dismiss it. Then others spoke. Linda, A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a trembling voice stood up, clutching a tissue in her weathered hands. The room fell silent, the weight of her grief palpable. "I'm a mother," she began, her voice cracking. "My son was stopped by an officer one night, just for taking a shortcut home after basketball practice. He was 17, full of dreams. He never made it back." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she straightened her spine, her words cutting through the air. "I don't hate all cops, but I'll never stop wondering why my boy had to pay for someone else's snap judgment." John's throat tightened, his hands clenching into fists in his lap. He tried to hold onto his composure, but Linda's pain clawed at him, dredging up memories of his own stops, his own quick decisions. Next came Miguel, a young man in a faded t-shirt, his broad shoulders hunched as he rose. His dark eyes carried a quiet anguish, a storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. "I was on my way to my first job interview," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Clean shirt, tie in my bag, ready to start something new. Then they stopped me, said I matched some suspect's description. I told them where I was going, begged them to listen. They didn't. Handcuffed me, held me for 2 hours. I missed that interview, lost the job." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I wasn't a criminal. I was just a guy trying to build a life." John's chest ached as Miguel's words sank in, stirring echoes of moments he'd once brushed off, times he'd cuffed someone, ignored their pleas. Convinced he was right, the session wore on, each story piling onto John like bricks, heavy and unyielding. He remembered a night years back, stopping a young black man driving a sleek car through a rough neighborhood. The guy's hands had shaken as he handed over his license, his voice stuttering as he explained it was his boss's car. John hadn't listened, just saw the suspicious mismatch and acted. Now that memory burned, shame creeping up his spine. Had he been the one to rob someone of their dignity, their chance, without a second thought? When the day ended, John stayed in his seat, staring at the scuffed floor as the others filed out. Rachel approached, her steps soft against the linoleum, and sat beside him, not too close, giving him space to breathe. "John," she said gently, her voice a lifeline in the chaos of his thoughts. "I know this isn't easy to hear. You've put everything into your work, and that's not nothing. But sometimes the things we hold on to, discipline, toughness, can blind us to what's real." He looked up, his eyes clouded with confusion and a raw, unspoken hurt. "You don't know what it's like," he murmured, his voice low, almost pleading. "Making calls in a heartbeat, no time to think about feelings." Rachel nodded, her expression warm but firm. "I get that. I'm not saying your job doesn't demand sacrifice or guts. But what if listening, understanding, made you better at it, not weaker, stronger, in a way that actually serves people?" Her words sank into him, melting the edges of his resistance. He didn't argue this time. Something in him shifted, a crack widening in the wall he'd spent years fortifying. As he left that day, the air outside felt cooler, sharper against his skin. His mind was quieter, but tangled with thoughts he'd never entertained before. The story of Rockles, Linda's, Miguel's clung to him, their voices weaving into a tapestry of doubt and revelation. Maybe strength wasn't just the power to command, to control. Maybe it was in the humility to see, to feel, to change. In the weeks that followed, John's world tilted further off its axis. Each session stripped away another layer of the certainty he'd worn like armor. At home, he'd sit in his dimly lit living room, the glow of a single lamp casting shadows across the metals lining his shelf. Once, those awards had gleamed with pride, proof of his resolve, his unflinching dedication. Now, they stared back at him, dull and accusing, relics of a man he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. Every night, his mind replayed old patrols like a flickering film reel, the woman he'd pulled from her car, her eyes wide with fear as he barked orders, the teenager he'd pinned against a wall, ignoring his stammered explanations. Scenes he'd once seen as victories now twisted into questions. Had he been just, or had he been blind? The lessons lingered, heavy and inescapable. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about seeing people, not threats. Power wielded without care didn't protect, it wounded, leaving scars that rippled far beyond the moment. For the first time, John felt the weight of those consequences, and with it, a fragile hope that he could learn to be the kind of cop who built trust, not fear. The road ahead was uncertain, but as he stared into the night, he knew one thing: the strength he'd chased all his life might just lie in the courage to let empathy in. John Miller had spent years cloaked in the certainty that his iron-fisted approach to law enforcement was a shield for the community he swore to protect. Each decisive action, each stern command had seen them as testaments to his strength, a bulwark against chaos. But now, those same memories pressed down on him like a leaden weight, sinking into his chest with every breath. The faces of those he'd confronted, the sharp edges of his own voice echoing in his mind, they haunted him, whispering doubts he couldn't silence. Had his resolve, once a source of pride, carved wounds into the very people he'd meant to safeguard? The thought gnawed at him, relentless and unyielding, stirring a storm of unease he couldn't outrun. One restless night, the walls of his apartment seemed to close in, suffocating him with the weight of his reflections. Desperate for relief, John slipped on his jacket and stepped into the cool embrace of the city's darkness. The streets stretched out before him, silent and empty. Bathed in the dim glow of flickering streetlights, he walked aimlessly, hands shoved deep into his pockets, the chill biting at his knuckles. The city had patrolled its corners, memorized its rhythms, worn its badge with honor, yet tonight it felt foreign. The shadows cast by towering buildings seemed to judge him, and the quiet hum of distant traffic carried an accusatory undertone. John, the protector, now felt like an outsider, adrift in a world he'd once commanded. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the training room, casting long, golden streaks across the worn wooden floor. Rachel, the instructor, stood at the front, her voice steady and warm as she outlined a new exercise. "Write about a moment you hurt someone," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "A time you wish you could take back." The others around John, fellow officers with weathered faces and guarded posture, shifted in their seats, pencils scratching against paper as they poured out their regrets. But John sat frozen, his pen hovering over the blank page like a bird afraid to land. The white expanse stared back at him, a towering wall he couldn't scale. His mind churned with flashes of the past, harsh words barked at trembling civilians. Hands clenched around cuffs to type, but he pushed them away, his jaw tightening. To write them down was to admit them, to let the cracks in his armor show. He couldn't. Not yet. Rachel noticed his stillness amid the rustle of turning pages. She approached quietly, her footsteps soft against the creaking floorboards, her presence a gentle intrusion. "John," she said, her voice low and kind, "we can't undo what's done, but facing it, learning from it's how we grow." Her words were a lifeline. But John's gaze flickered up to meet hers, his hazel eyes clouded with turmoil. He parted his lips as if to speak, to spill the tangle of guilt and defiance warring within him. But no sound came. He shook his head, a silent surrender, and dropped his eyes back to the untouched page. Rachel didn't push. She simply nodded, her expression free of judgment, and returned to the group. Yet her words lingered, sinking into him like rain into parched earth, stirring something he couldn't name. That night, sleep eluded him. John lay in bed, the sheets twisted around his legs as he tossed and turned, his mind a battlefield of unrelenting images. He saw the woman he'd yanked from her car, her wide eyes brimming with fear and confusion as she stumbled onto the pavement. He saw the young man, barely out of his teens, whose defiance had melted into a wounded, disappointed stare under John's unrelenting glare. And then there was the mother, her voice trembling, her hands clutching a faded photograph of her son, lost to a system too rigid, too biased to see his humanity. Each memory was a shard of glass, cutting deeper with every restless turn. Finally, he gave up, dragging himself to the living room. He sank into an old armchair, its fabric worn smooth by years of use, and stared at the police badge resting on the coffee table. Once, it had gleamed with promise, a symbol of duty and pride. Now, it seemed tarnished not by time, but by the weight of his own actions. Had his pursuit of order stripped him of the compassion his role demanded? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The following day, the training room buzzed with quiet energy. John didn't retreat to his usual spot in the back, shrouded in shadows. Instead, he chose a chair near the front, the sunlight warming his shoulders. A small, deliberate step toward something new. When the time came to share, the room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out, his voice rough and unsteady. "I've always thought toughness made me a good cop," he began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I believed strict rules, discipline, that's what kept things right. But hearing your stories," he paused, his gaze dropping to the floor, then lifting to meet the groups. "I don't know anymore. It's making me question everything I've done, everything I've stood for." The admission hung there, raw and vulnerable, and the room held its breath. Rachel watched him, her eyes soft with understanding, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Sometimes, John," she said gently, "asking those questions is the beginning of something bigger. None of us get it right every time. What matters is you're willing to look back and maybe change." Her words eased the ache in his chest, just a little, but uncertainty still coiled around him. Could he keep doing this job without the toughness that had defined him? Was there a way to enforce the law with empathy, to protect without wounding? The conflict churned within him, a storm with no clear horizon. Yet, as the days unfolded, John began to see a truth he'd long ignored. Real strength wasn't an unwavering certainty, but in the courage to admit fault and seek redemption. It was a hard road, shadowed with doubt, but it promised something he hadn't felt in yearship. Weeks later, John stood beside Rachel at a community event downtown, the air thick with the scent of fresh coffee and the murmur of voices. The center was alive with activity tables piled high with donations, children darting through the crowd, their laughter cutting through the hum of conversation. John felt out of place, his broad shoulders stiff in his uniform, his instinct screaming that authority was his shield. But as he watched Rachel move through the room, her smile easy, her hands quick to help, he saw something different. She knelt beside an elderly woman struggling to stand, her gray hair falling across her face, and guided her to a chair with a tenderness that left John speechless. Later, as he hefted a box of canned goods into the hall, he caught sight of a group of kids racing around, their sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. His first impulse was to call out, to restore order, but Rachel's voice broke through. "Let them be," she said, her tone light. "Sometimes you don't need to control everything." He stopped, the box still in his arms, and felt the tension in his shoulders loosen. Maybe she was right. One evening, as the event wound down, John spotted a small boy lingering at the edge of the street, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his dark eyes darting nervously toward the crosswalk. The old John would have barked an order, his voice sharp and commanding, but this time, he softened. He approached slowly, his boots scuffing the pavement, and crouched to the boy's level. "Hey, buddy," he said, his tone warm. "Need help getting across?" The boy hesitated, clutching his straps tighter. "My mom says not to talk to strangers," he mumbled, his voice small but firm. John chuckled, a rare lightness bubbling up. "Smart mom. I'm a police officer, foul hair to help. Want me to walk with you?" The boy's face brightened, a shy grin breaking through as he nodded. Together, they crossed the street, John's hand steady on the boy's shoulder, the green light casting a soft glow around them. On the other side, the boy turned, his eyes shining. "Thanks, officer. You're nice." The words hit John like a wave, simple yet profound, washing away years of cold detachment. He watched the boy skip toward home, a quiet joy blooming in his chest, a joy not of power, but of connection. From that day, John threw himself into the community, his once rigid demeanor giving way to something softer, more human. He helped a young mother gather her daughter's scattered toys, earning a grateful smile where once there'd been wariness. An old man who'd once turned him away now offered a gruff nod at the market, a silent truce. Trust came slowly, built on small acts, but John embraced the challenge. Rachel, ever his guide, watched his transformation with pride. "See," she said one afternoon, stacking gift boxes beside him, "strength isn't always loud. It's in the quiet thing-skinness. Empathy. You're finding your way." John nodded, the words settling into him. The path ahead was long, shadowed by past mistakes, but it stretched towards something brighter, a chance to protect with heart, to serve with humanity. Each step, he knew, was a lesson in justice, a reminder that power unchecked could wound, but power tempered with care could heal. John Miller stood in the dim light of the community center, his broad shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of a realization that had taken months to sink in. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity radiating from the faces of the people seated before him. Once, he'd walked into rooms like this as a police officer exuding unshakable authority, his badge gleaming like a shield against doubt. But tonight was different. His uniform felt less like armor and more like a relic of a past self, a man who had mistaken power for strength, rigidity for justice. His heart thudded in his chest, a nervous rhythm he hadn't felt since his first day on the force. But he welcomed it. This discomfort was a sign of growth, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself for years. Across the room, Rachel leaned against a folding table, her arms crossed casually but her eyes sharp with quiet pride. She'd been his guide through this uncharted territory, the one who'd held up a mirror to his flaws and dared him to look. Her dark hair framed a face that carried both gentleness and resolve, and her presence steadied him as he prepared to speak. She wasn't just a colleague anymore. Ash was a lifeline, a reminder of the lessons he'd fought so hard to learn. John took a deep breath, the faint scent of stale coffee and wormwood filling his lungs, and stepped forward. The creak of the wooden floor echoed in the silence, amplifying the weight of the moment. For years, John had believed that strength was a clenched fist, a barked command, a line drawn in the sand that no one dared cross. He'd spent his career enforcing order with an iron will, convinced that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford and that empathy was a weakness he couldn't indulge. But that belief had crumbled, piece by piece, over the weeks he'd spent volunteering alongside Rachel. It started with small things, the way a weary mother's eyes softened when he carried her groceries, without being asked, or the hesitant gratitude in a teenager's voice when John listened instead of lectured. Each encounter chipped away at his old convictions, revealing a truth he'd buried deep. Real strength wasn't about bending others to his will. It was about lifting them up, earning their faith through actions that spoke louder than any badge ever could. As he stood there, the memory of those moments flooded back. He could still feel the rough texture of the cardboard boxes he'd hauled for a struggling family, the ache in his arms a quiet testament to the shift within him. He remembered the elderly man who'd gripped his hand after John spent an hour fixing a broken porch step, the man's weathered fingers trembling not from age but from relief. "Thank you," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. And John had felt something stir inside him, a warmth he hadn't known he was capable of. For the first time, he understood that service wasn't a tool for control. It was a bridge, a way to stand shoulder to shoulder with people in their struggles, to see them not as threats to be managed, but as lives to be valued. That realization had deepened during his empathy training, a program he'd once dismissed as a waste of time. Rachel had led him through it with a patience that both frustrated and humbled him. She'd introduced him to people whose stories pierced through his armorman, and women who'd been bruised by the very system he'd upheld, their trust shattered by officers like the one he used to be. One woman, Maria, had sat across from him, her hands twisting nervously in her lap as she recounted how a single misunderstanding with police had cost her family everything. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady, and John felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. He'd wanted to look away, to retreat into the familiar shell of denial, but Rachel's quiet presence beside him kept him rooted. She didn't judge him, she simply listened, her silence urging him to do the same. That night, as he lay awake in his small apartment, the hum of the city filtering through the cracked window, John wrestled with what he'd heard. The old John would have brushed it off, insisting that order demanded sacrifice, that a few broken lives were the cost of safety. But the man he was becoming couldn't ignore the ache in his chest, the nagging sense that he'd been complicit in something unjust. He thought of Maria's children, growing up with a mother too afraid to call for help, and he wondered how many others he'd failed in his blind pursuit of authority. It was a bitter pill, but swallowing it was the first step toward change. That change crystallized when he and Rachel launched Bridge the Gap, a program born from their shared vision of a police force rooted in understanding rather than dominance. The idea was simple but radical: bring officers and community members together, not as adversaries, but as equals. They'd sit in circles, not behind desks, sharing stories instead of issuing commands. John imagined rooms filled with voices, some angry, some hopeful, finding common ground over chipped coffee mugs and folding chairs. He saw it as a chance to prove that kindness wasn't a liability in law enforcement. It was a necessity. Rachel had clapped him on the shoulder when they finalized the plan, her grin wide and infectious. "You're starting to get it, Miller," she'd said, and he'd felt a flicker of pride he hadn't earned in years. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. The day they announced Bridge the Gap at the precinct, John stood before a room of folded arms and skeptical stares. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the faces of his colleagues, men and women he'd once led with unwavering certainty. Paul, a grizzled officer with a jaw like granite and a temper to match, was the first to break the silence. He rose from his chair, the scrape of metal against linoleum cutting through the murmur of the room. "We're cops, John, not counselors," he said, his voice rough with disdain. "Our job is to keep order, not hold hands and sing songs about feelings." A few others nodded, their smirks sharp as knives, and John felt the old heat of defiance rise in his throat. Years ago, he would have met Paul's challenge with a glare and a barked rebuttal, reasserting his dominance like a wolf guarding its territory. But this time, he paused, letting the tension hang heavy in the air. He glanced at Rachel, who stood near the back, her expression calm but expectant, and drew strength from her quiet faith in him. When he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, carrying a conviction that surprised even himself. "Paul, I get it. I used to think the same weightness was all that mattered, and anything less was weakness. But I've seen what happens when we lean too hard on that. We don't just lose trust, we lose the people we're supposed to protect. Strength isn't just about control, it's about connection." Paul's eyes narrowed, his skepticism etched into every line of his weathered face. "You've changed, John," he said, crossing his arms. "The guy I knew didn't waste time on this soft stuff. Maybe you're not cut out for this job anymore." The words stung, but John didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled a small, genuine curve of his lips that caught Paul off guard. "Maybe I have changed," he admitted, his tone light but firm, "but not into something weaker. I've just figured out that patience and empathy aren't the opposite of strength, they are part of it. We can enforce the law and still care about the people we serve." The room shifted then, the air growing quieter as his words settled. A younger officer, Sam, piped up from the back, his voice tinged with confusion. Sam had once idolized John for his no-nonsense approach, trailing him on patrols like an eager pup. Now, he leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "How's listening to a bunch of stories supposed to help us keep the streets safe?" "I don't see the point, John." His honesty was raw, unguarded, and John met it with the same openness. "I didn't either, Sam," he said, his gaze locking with the younger man's. "I thought it was all talk, no action. But then I saw it every time we listen, we build something. Trust, cooperation. People start seeing us as allies, not enemies. That's how we stop trouble before it starts." Without fists or handcuffs, the room fell silent, the hum of the lights the only sound as his colleagues processed his words. Even Paul, still standing with his arms crossed, softened slightly, his jaw unclenching as doubt flickered in his eyes. John pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "During training, I met people who've been hurt by us. They're not just names on a report. They're parents, kids, neighbors. We've let them down, and that's on us to fix. Without empathy, we're just machines in uniforms, not protectors." He paused, letting the weight of his confession linger, then added, "Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding what people need to feel safe and giving it to them." After the meeting, as the crowd thinned and the clatter of chairs being stacked filled the air, a few officers lingered. Lisa, a stern woman who'd always favored a hardline approach, approached him hesitantly. Her short-cropped hair framed a face usually set in stone, but tonight, her eyes held a flicker of curiosity. "I thought you were crazy, John," she said, her voice low, almost reluctant. "All this empathy talk, it sounded like fluff. But what you said back there, I don't know. Maybe there's something to it. I might check out this Bridge the Gap thing." John's chest swelled with a quiet hope, and he nodded, offering her a warm smile. "I'd like that, Lisa. It's not about throwing out what we know, it's about adding to it." The first day of Bridge the Gap arrived a week later, and John stood beside Rachel in the community center, facing a mismatched group of officers and residents. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Cops in stiff uniforms sat beside civilians in worn jackets, their postures guarded but curious. John's palms were sweaty, but he squared his shoulders and stepped forward, his voice cutting through the hum. "I used to think my job was all about authority," he began, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "I was wrong. I've made mistakes big once and I've let people down. But I'm here to change that, and I hope you'll help me." He shared his story, raw and unfiltered, laying bare the biases he'd carried and the lessons he'd learned. Rachel stood beside him, her pride palpable, and when he finished, the room erupted into tentative conversation, soared at first, then warm with possibility. As weeks turned to months, Bridge the Gap grew. Paul showed up one day, grumbling but present, his gruff exterior softening as he listened to a father recount his fears for his son. Sam joined too, his youthful energy finding new purpose in the connections he forged. Lisa became a regular, her sharp edges blunting as she swapped stories with a woman who'd once feared her. John watched it unfold, marveling at the ripple effect of his own transformation. He'd once wielded power like a hammer, oblivious to the cracks it left behind. Now, he saw the consequences of that arrogancy and the beauty of repairing it. The community gathering came on a crisp March evening, the sky streaked with orange as John stepped onto a makeshift stage. The crowd was larger than he'd expected, their faces a mosaic of hope and doubt. Rachel lingered nearby, her encouraging nod a lifeline as he began. "I'm not here as the officer I was," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his gut. "I'm here as a man who's messed up, who's sorry, and who wants to do better. I used to think strength was about control, but real strength is compassion. I'm asking for your forgiveness and your help to build something better." His apology hung in the air, vulnerable and raw, and then an older man's voice broke through. "I never thought I'd see you own up, John. Takes guts. Maybe we all get a second shot." Others stepped forward, their stories weaving a fragile thread of trust, and John knew this was just the beginning. Through it all, John learned a lesson deeper than any law. Justice wasn't a gavel slamming down, but a hand reaching out. Power, unchecked, bred fear and division, tempered with empathy. It built bridges. He wasn't perfect, but he was committed to Rachel, to his colleagues, to the people he'd once failed. And as he stood there, the weight of his past lifting with each shared word, he felt the man he'd always wanted to be finally taking shape, a protector not just in duty, but in heart. On a crisp afternoon, the air thick with the scent of autumn leaves, Action stepped forward through the crowd, her boots clicking softly against the worn wooden floor of the community hall. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, a storm of emotions swirling within her grief for the past, hope for what could be. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she extended it toward John Miller, a man whose name had once been whispered with bitterness in these very walls. Her expression was a tapestry of forgiveness, woven with threads of pain and resilience, and her voice, though soft, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. "Not everyone has the courage to stand here and say they're sorry. Not like this," she said, her words cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. "Thank you, John, for choosing to turn things around." John stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling as though a boulder had been lifted from his chest. The tightness that had gripped him for months, years, perhaps dissolved in the warmth of her words. Relief flooded through him, a tidal wave that washed away the guilt he'd carried like a second skin. He could barely believe it. Forgiveness, freely given, and encouragement. A lifeline tossed to a man who'd once thought himself beyond redemption. He knew this wasn't the end, though. Acceptance wasn't a gift handed over lightly. It was a garden that demanded constant tending, a path carved through relentless effort. But for the first time in a long while, John felt ready to walk a road not paved with the cold stone of authority, but with the softer earth of empathy and dedication. As Action stepped back, another figure emerged from the crowd, a tall man with a weathered face and hands roughened by years of labor. He approached John with purpose, his stride steady, and clasped John's hand in a grip that spoke of solidarity. "John," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "We're not asking for perfection. None of us are saints. But if you lead with your heart, with compassion, you'll find us right there beside you." His eyes, lined with the wisdom of hard-earned years, held a quiet strength that bolstered John's resolve. This wasn't just a handshake. It was a promise, a tether to a community John had once pushed away. Nearby, Rachel stood watching, her heart swelling with a pride so fierce it nearly brought her to tears. Her dark eyes shimmered as she gazed at John, the man she'd seen wrestle with shadows both within himself and cast by others. She knew the battles he'd fought, the sleepless nights haunted by regret, the moments he'd stared into the mirror and barely recognized the face staring back. To see him here, standing tall in this moment of redemption, filled her with a reverence that went beyond mere admiration. It was respect for his transformation, yes, but more so for the raw courage it took to face his failures head-on and say, "I will do better." The ceremony drew to a close, the hall buzzing with a warmth that felt almost tangible, like a blanket draped over the shoulders of everyone present. Laughter mingled with the clink of glasses, and the tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud had dissipated, leaving behind a sky of possibility. John positioned himself near the exit, his broad shoulders squared, but his demeanor softer than ever before. One by one, people approached him with hesitant smiles, others with open gratitude, each offering a handshake or a quiet word of thanks. An elderly woman, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, shuffled forward. She'd once been one of his fiercest critics, her sharp tongue a blade that had cut deep during town meetings. Now, she took his hand in her frail, trembling grasp, her smile gentle as a spring breeze. "Son," she said, her voice quavering but firm, "we all stumble. What counts is whether we're brave enough to pick ourselves up and make things right." Her words landed like a balm on wounds John hadn't realized were still raw. And with every handshake, every fleeting smile, he felt the threads of connection weaving tighter between him and this community. The resentment that had once festered was fading, replaced by a mutual understanding, a shared dream of something better. As the last of the guests trickled out, John and Rachel lingered in the now quiet hall. The echoes of voices had faded, leaving only the soft creak of the wooden beams overhead and the faint hum of a world. Settling into dusk, Rachel rested a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but steady, grounding him in the moment. "You did it, John," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is just the start, but look at what it's already become." John turned to her, his eyes alight with a determination that felt unshakable. He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew the road ahead would be long, paved with challenges that would test his resolve, but he was prepared, armed with an open heart, a renewed purpose, and the lessons of a program called Bridge the Gap that had ceased to be mere training and had become the compass guiding his every step. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, his voice low but brimming with gratitude. "I wouldn't have seen the man I could be without you." Her presence had been his anchor, her belief in him a light through the darkest stretches of his journey. Together, they stepped out of the hall into the cool evening air, the sky above streaked with the last hues of sunset. John felt a certainty settle into his bones. He would never walk alone again. He had a community now, allies like Rachel, and a conviction that he could become not just a better police officer, but a protector rooted in empathy and justice. A justice not wielded as a weapon, but offered as a bridge. For John, that was the truest strength he'd ever sought. The ceremony had been a turning point, a beacon that illuminated a new mission. Bridge the Gap wasn't just a fleeting exercise in empathy. It was a spark that could ignite a revolution in how the police and the community intertwined. The idea thrilled him, setting his mind ablaze with possibility. If he once rigid, once unyielding called change, then couldn't anyone? Why not weave Bridge the Gap into the very fabric of police training, ensuring that every recruit stepped into their role with eyes wide open to the humanity they were meant to serve? He shared the thought with Rachel that night, his words tumbling out in a rush of excitement. She leaned forward, her face lighting up with the same fire. "Yes, John," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "If we can lay that foundation from the beginning, teach every officer to listen, to understand, to feel what the people feel, could reshape the whole department." Imagine recruits learning from your story, your struggles. It could show them what's possible. Encouraged by her unwavering support, John requested a meeting with Captain Martinez, a man whose stern exterior hid a deep well of wisdom. The captain had watched John's metamorphosis unfold, had seen the shift from a man cloaked in authority to one draped in accountability. In the small, cluttered office, John laid out his vision with a fervor he hadn't known he possessed. He spoke of making Bridge the Gap a cornerstone of training, of equipping officers with the tools to approach every situation with compassion, as well as competence. If they understand the community from day one, he said, his hands gesturing animatedly, they'll handle things different libiter. It's not just about enforcing the law, it's about building trust. Martinez listened, his brow furrowed in thought, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the desk. When John finished, the captain leaned back, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I've seen the change in you, Miller, he said. I've seen how the community's come around. This idea, it's bold, maybe even revolutionary, and I think you're the right man to lead it. The words struck John like a thunderclap, resonating deep within him. He'd never dreamed of leading something so significant, but now he saw it as more than an opportunity. It was a chance to atone, to give back to a community he'd once failed. With Rachel and Martinez behind him, he dove into the work. They organized meetings with community representatives, filling the hall once more with voices from every corner of the town, social activists with fiery spirits, teachers with gentle patience, and residents whose encounters with the law had left scars they were willing to share. Each brought a piece of the puzzle, their stories shaping a program that was as practical as it was profound. John insisted on storytelling as its heart reel, raw experiences like Rachel's quiet strength or his own faltering steps toward redemption. They added role-playing, too, vivid scenarios where officers faced tense moments and learned to diffuse them with words instead of force. But John didn't stop there. This can't just be for rookies, he argued in one meeting, his voice steady with conviction. Every officer, no matter how long they've served, can grow. I'm living proof of that. The idea met resistance, of course. Some of his colleagues clung to the old ways, their arms crossed and their faces set in stubborn lines. We're cops, not counselors, one grumbled during a heated discussion, his tone sharp with disdain. In the past, John might have snapped back, his temper flaring like dry tinder. But now, he took a breath, meeting the man's glare with calm resolve. I thought that way once too, he said. But I've learned that understanding the people we serve doesn't make us weak, it makes us smarter. Safer, it's about doing our job right. Slowly, his patience began to chip away at the skepticism. A few officers, intrigued despite themselves, signed up for sessions. Rachel's story saw resilience, of hope paired with the community's voices started to shift perspectives. One young officer, a skeptic from the start, approached John after a training, his shoulders hunched with reluctant admission. Maybe you're onto something, he muttered. I've been too stiff, too focused on the rules. Forgot we're here to protect people, not just police them. Under John's steady hand, Bridge the Gap took root, blossoming into a cornerstone of the department's culture. Monthly gatherings brought officers and residents together not as adversaries, but as partners sharing meals, stories, and lessons that deepened their understanding of one another. Rachel, who'd stood by John through every triumph and stumble, watched the changes unfold with a quiet pride that glowed in her eyes. You did it, she told him after a particularly powerful session, her voice soft but sure. You've made this part of who we are. This is going to last. John smiled, a mix of hope and humility warming his chest. From a man once reviled, he'd become a catalyst for something greater, a department where strength wasn't just a badge or a gun, but a willingness to listen, to care. With Bridge the Gap, he and Rachel had built a foundation of trust and respect, a bridge spanning the chasm that had once divided police and community. As he reflected on it all, John saw the arc of his journey clearly. Every misstep, every moment of doubt had led him here. This wasn't just his new beginning, it was the community's, too. And in that, he found a profound lesson. Justice isn't a gavel slammed in judgment, but a hand extended in understanding. Power, when abused, fractures when tempered with empathy. It heals. For John Miller, that truth was the legacy he'd leave behind a promise to serve, not just with authority, but with heart.